factories, kind of just reviewing Suwannee County's economy over the years. A lot of changes have been made. Even in your lifetimes, there's been a lot of changes. So, up until about 1900 or so, we've got mainly farming around Suwannee County and the whole country, to be honest. The early settlers had to deal with Seminole Indian attacks and such like that, but by the 1900s, those were all gone, way in the past, several generations behind, and we've got a lot of farms that have opened up. By 1900, our population was 18,000, which is a 50% increase from 10 years before, so we were growing drastically in population. Our lumber and turpentine industries were going full force. We also had some brick manufacturing and wholesaling. But farming basically was the bread and butter for most everybody here in Suwannee County. Some of those were able to do well enough off, they were able to build a lot of nice Victorian era homes, Ohio, Duval, those kinds of things. So some folks were in the money, but a lot of folks were just running the mill, going about their farming duties. That was just their way of life, chores done by hand. You got up before dark or before daylight while it's still dark to milk the cows, feed the chickens, hogs, by daytime after school, or if you went to school, you would be farming, you'd be doing some of these things, plowing with a walking plow, or maybe a horse or mule if you were lucky. You might go to town once a week to get those few items that you did not produce on the farm. Most everything you had at the farm already. There was no power, no electricity, I should say, for most everybody. So the power came from the farmer and the family, the animals, those kinds of things. You had water pumps, you had outhouses, you had candles and lanterns, all that kind of stuff. So very quaint compared to modern day life way of living for those from 100, 150 years ago. And these are just a few pictures. The ones on the right, bottom right, is the W.B. Howland family. You might have heard of the name W.B. Howland since they still run the store there. But basically they're kind of farming type stuff folks. Now nationwide, just in about a 30-year time from 1870 to 1900, the number of farmers had dropped from half of all workers in the entire country to about 1/3. That was in the country. In Suwannee County, we were still very agricultural, so our numbers were still a lot higher than what had become the national average. But pretty much, if you were to just say, how did an average person in Suwannee County live in 1900, you see it right there in front of you, living like that. But there were other industries, a lot of them related to agriculture, that were also thriving here in Suwannee County. You had things like the timber industry, turpentine, rosin, lumber, all those kinds of things. Lots of millions of feet, millions of barrels, those kinds of things being produced every year. And pretty much all the communities had at least a sawmill, those kinds of things. They were able to do planing and sawing, those kinds of things. And you had other turpentine mills and such in some of the larger communities, and going from there. A lot of folks started to make their fortune in these kinds of things. People like T.T. Scott, who owned one of the last large sawmills here in Suwannee County. You've got the Dowlings, you've got several other folks that basically are running sawmills in and around Suwannee County. There's a 1905 article that I quoted, and I wanted to quote it for you. It says, in Suwannee County, with a population of 20,000, contains 440,000 acres. The greater part of the county is either under cultivation or rich in tracts of valuable timber land. The population of the country districts is made up largely of a very thrifty class of farmers who raise cotton, corn, cane, potatoes, cattle, and hogs. Cotton is the money crop. Enough of the staples are raised, however, to make the farmer independent. He is thus able to hold the cotton for the higher market prices. The farming lands are fertile, and good harvests are reaped every season. Situated in such a section, the city in its midst has a fortunate setting. So again, still primarily agriculture. People are making money off of it and growing bigger businesses, but it's still agriculture based, and that was pretty much this area for sure in the early 1900s. But we did have things like tourist destination type things that we would call it today. Before and after the turn of the century, from the 1800s to 1900s, you've got places like Suwannee Springs, which that's kind of a poor picture, but it's a picture I've had for a long time. But that's one of the hotels in Suwannee Springs. And Suwannee Springs have been a resort since the 1830s, 1840s. Several hotels have been built and burned and then rebuilt. But people were coming from all around the world to those locations. Suwannee Springs, eventually Dowling Park, or what would come to be called Dowling Park. And those became some of the resorts. I called them the Disney World at the time, but they were different. They were health resorts, if you will. You could go there, drink the sulfur water. You could bathe in that sulfur water, stinky as it might be. You could go relax. You could go to the spa, so to speak. You could go hunting. You could go fishing. Pretty much whatever you kind of wanted to do in a country setting, you could do in these hotels. Dowling Park had a bowling alley at theirs, running water, hot and cold running water, woohoo. That was a big deal back then. So you had that tourist destination type thing, but a lot of the money still came from agriculture. You've got places like Live Oak that are growing. People like George Porter, who built the first electric plant on the east side of Live Oak. And he also built a large planing mill close to that, which was also close to Thomas Dowling's large sawmill. George Porter also had his Live Oak manufacturing company. And he dressed the lumber, he operated the electric light plant, and he also had an ice manufacturing plant. So all these modern day conveniences, as we call them, Mr. Porter and others like him brought into, starting with Live Oak, but then eventually Branford and other places got them too. The report from 1905 says that the company's mills and plants were at capacity, even though the ice plant had recently been increased in size and had a capacity of 20 tons. They were at capacity, so a lot of growing involved, especially in Live Oak. And that's because Live Oak in the early 1900s, as we've talked about in previous presentations, was the 5th largest city in the state of Florida. It was the largest inland city. It was Jacksonville, Pensacola, Tampa, Key West, Live Oak, size-wise. Very interesting. So we had about 7,200 citizens. So really about the same amount we have today. It wasn't like it was much different, just some of these other places grew a lot more in the ensuing decades. But the city purchased Mr. Dowling's personal waterworks that he had built so he could have running water at his own home. And that operated for more than 100 years. And the tower is still there, just off Duval Street. At one point, it was the oldest one east of the Mississippi, at least, that was operating, but they shut it down a few years ago, sadly. Downtown Live Oak, not just Live Oak, but I've got a lot more pictures and information on Live Oak, but you see the first generation of wooden structures being replaced, either because they burned down or they're outdated or old or termites or something, but basically they're being replaced by brick structures. And you see these buildings circa 1906, 1907, and most of these buildings are still here today with us. A couple are burned down, but basically this is looking south on 129 or Ohio Avenue, looking south from the railroad track. So you can pretty much, those buildings are still there. You see the courthouse over towards the right. But all those buildings really, except for this one here, burned down in the 20s, I believe, and was replaced. But pretty much all those other buildings are still there today. But that's because they were built of brick, they were made to last, no longer wood. But that was befitting a city of our size at that point. Plus, there was a 1908 article, and it talked about some of the professions that we have in Live Oak at the point. And it was says that all professions are represented, including physicians, surgeons, opticians, oculists, preachers and teachers, attorneys, civil engineers, dentists, veterinary surgeons, and all others that are needed in a wide awake community. So we have all kinds of professions, and some of these we don't even have today anymore, it seems. But we had them back then. That same article talked about a lot of the places to stay. You had places like the Ethel Hotel, the recently completed Suwannee Hotel, which is, you can't really see it because it hadn't been built yet, but it's where those trees are. Pretty much it'd be right here. It had not been completed at this point. Let's see, you had the Brown House, the Ohio Ohio House, and lots of boarding houses. You had miles of sidewalks being poured and more added each month. Lots of stuff. So Live Oak was growing. It was becoming less agricultural in town and more cityfied, if you will. Some of the businesses a lot of them operating agricultural goods, but a lot of the bigger businesses in Live Oak included the Worth Stevens Company, which this is a picture from 1908. But it has become probably the biggest business in Suwannee County, at least in Live Oak, around 1905. General merchandise, cotton, produce, pretty much if you needed it, they had most of it or they knew where to get it. Dry goods, clothing, shoes, hats, notions, furniture, heavy and fancy groceries, hardware, farming implements, labor-saving farming machinery, wire fence, fertilizers. One of the things they prided themselves was that they imported genuine German kainit, which was a salt of potassium used for making fertilizer. And that was one of their advertisements. Hey, we've got this stuff. Nobody else does, but we do. And they also bought and sold Sea Island cotton, which was grown in great abundance in Suwannee County. I'll talk about more in just a few minutes. But it was well-to-do. I think the building itself had about 16,000 square feet. So not necessarily the biggest building, but it had the most stuff and had access to the most stuff of any business that I've been able to find at that time of Suwannee County and Live Oak's history.
Where was the building?
The building was downtown on, let me think, should have looked it up. Pine Avenue and Howard Street, I believe. So pretty much where Millennium Park is, I believe at one point, or close by. It's one of those two places. Because there's several different businesses. And if it wasn't there, it was on the east side of 129. Because you've also got the Heinley Stevens. That was Worth Stevens. You've also got the Heinley Dash Stevens. So Mr. Stevens went in business, and actually Worth Stevens, it was his dad, A.C. Stevens, that started it. Anyway, lots of history about those businesses. But Heinley Stevens was another large firm. And they dealt more with livestock, buggies, carriages. It covered about half a block. It was 33,000 square feet floor space, over 2 floors. So this was on the east side of Howard Street. On Ohio Avenue on Howard Street. So, yeah, lots of wares, and they could accommodate 100 head of stock at one time. Plus, they were right there by the railroad, easy to get in and off from the railroad. They also had the Florida Livestock and Vehicle Company, which dealt horses, mules, carriages, and buggies. Sid Connor operated that in 1905. You also had on Ohio Avenue, about where Susie's was until recently, the J.B. Barton furniture establishment. So you had lots of big businesses. And because of that, you've got hotels bringing people in. That was the leading hotel there, the Ethel House, or the Ethel Hotel. It was run by Hobson and Company. It was on Connor Street facing the railroad tracks. So those trees are pretty much about where Connor Street is. Connor Street would be this dirt road you can barely see right here. But that would be, trying to think what used to, Parks Johnson Insurance Agency used to be part of where it was. Between Almar Court and Texada Street, or Tuxedo, I think they renamed it. But anyway, basically they're on the north side of the block, facing the railroad. So that one was a nice hotel. It had been around, well, the brick portion was built, that you see there was built in 1885. But there was a wooden portion that was older, that was there prior to that. So it was one of the old hotels. Before that point, I think Nelson Connor owned in the 1860s, 1870s. So it was a long-standing hotel with different buildings built for it. But it was a pretty good-sized hotel, but even that, it was full. But you also had, like I said, the Brown House, the Magnolia House, and then also the Gruber House. The Brown House was the old courthouse, which after the courthouse was built, the one that we have today that was built in 1904, the previous one had been moved over across the street to where the jail is, and it operated as an apartment, or as a hotel and an apartment complex for another 60 or so years. The Magnolia House was another prominent place to stay, and that was next door to the courthouse. So lots of business, lots of hotels and those kinds of places for people to come in and stay, whether it was cotton season or whatever it might have been when they were selling a lot of stuff. Also, we had the Southern Business College, which had recently opened its doors in the early 1900s, and that was for young men and women to learn business skills such as typing and counting, etc., that were becoming more prevalent in Suwannee County and around. And it was a branch of the Tampa Business College. Live Oak in Suwannee County, it had also 5 newspapers, 5 of them just in Live Oak: Suwannee Democrat, Florida Christian Advocate, Present Truth Messenger, and the Florida Crescent. And then Brantford at one point, I think, had the Brantford Bee, and a few other names. Lots of newspapers just in Suwannee County in the early 1900s. And there was a 1905 article, and it was talking about some of these places, and then it said, hey, there are so many grocery stores, we're not even going to bother trying to list them all. There are just a lot of mom and pop butcher shops, all those kinds of things. You can go into the store, get what you need, get your hogs butchered, get your cows butchered, whatever needed to be done. We were growing, Live Oak especially, but to an extent, Brantford, even Dowling Park, McAlpin, some of the other places, Welder. Because all this trade, mainly agriculture, that's coming in, they needed to upgrade their depots and the railroads. So the Atlantic Coast Line built this new building in 1903 to replace an older structure, which was smaller and not covered really well. And so that ran for 60 years as an Atlantic Coast Line and a successor line. They shut it down. It was abandoned for about 20 years, and then it was rehabilitated in the 1980s, and now currently is the Suwannee County Historical Museum. But that was one of several freight depots just in Live Oak. And every community, whether it was Welborn or O'Brien or McAlpin, Dowling Park, wherever there was a railroad, and pretty much there was a railroad stop, you would have a depot, a smaller depot than what we have here in Live Oak, but you would have some sort of depot. But as the 20th century starts to go forward a few more years, in the early 1900s, the 1900s, 19-teens, you see more vehicles being produced. And these vehicles need a way to get across the Suwannee River. And so you see this first era of a vehicle bridge building, where basically I think in our starting in the fourth era, I would call it anyway, with the Dowling Park Bridge that was completed a couple years ago. That would be, I'd say, the 4th generation of bridges here. But this first generation, pretty much they all looked about the same. Before that point, you had a couple of railroad crossings over the river. You had a lot of ferry crossings, those kinds of things. You could use horses and wagons, but the automobiles couldn't really use the ferries so much. So they started building these vehicle bridges. So this is the first one at Dowling Park in circa 1906, 1913, somewhere in that era. I think closer to 1911, 1913. You also had Suwannee Springs, and this is one of the ones. This is the first vehicle bridge. And a lot of people think this is the one that's still there today. It's not. The one that's here today would be downriver about here. That is just upriver from the springs. You can still see the pylons on both sides of the river, but this one was built in the early 1900s. And you can see horse and buggy still being used a lot even there. And this was when Suwannee Springs was that resort. First vehicle bridge in Louisville, early 1900s. And then you've got Ellaville, which is now the Suwannee River State Park. You've got the first vehicle bridge to the left, and then the railroad bridge over to the right. And so you see those there. The stone embankment for this bridge is still there. If you go into the park and walk it, you can see part of the embankment. But yeah, pretty much these bridges, a lot of them were built by Converse Bridge Company in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The county just, I guess, knew folks there, and they usually were the ones that got the bid. They were the low bidder. It wasn't like they just gave it to them, but they were usually the low bidder, and so a lot of these bridges are the same design, this first generation anyway. But with this, you start losing out on some of the other things that Suwannee County had to offer, and that was steamboats. Steamboats became fewer and fewer. They kind of passed their prime in 1896. But up until that point, we had dozens of them up and down river. After the hurricane of 1896, a lot of them were either destroyed, damaged, or because of the timber being knocked out in this area, they were shifted to places like Apalachicola and down south part of the state. And so we didn't have as many steamboats, but we did have, in the early 1900s, we had 3 of them still running: the Thetis, City of Hawkinsville, and 3 states. So they pretty much had stopped operations by about 1910. But they weren't in sight for 60 years or so, 50, 60 years, They were a normal side of the Suwannee River, and a lot of them would carry cargo. That was the easiest way to get cargo in, because you didn't have cars and roads at that point. You had a couple railroads, but a lot of times it's just easier to transport it up by steamboat. And they would barter, they would trade, those kinds of things. And they would haul timber, they would haul cotton, they would haul ice blocks from up north before we had our own ice plants. But as these things began to be locally produced, you didn't need the steamboats to bring it to you. So between that and then the timber being wiped out in the hurricane in 1996, it just was not economically feasible to keep running these steamboats.
What wiped out in the hurricane, the sawmill structures or the trees themselves?
The trees themselves were flattened, but a lot of the sawmills were destroyed too. I mean, it was comparable to what we had in the last year or two, but because the structures were mainly wooden, most of them did not survive. Like in Branford, I think there was one building that was used by a lot of churches and stuff, because it was about the only one that was existing. Now, I think they had to prop it up, because it was not, today it would have been, no, the engineer would say you can't use this, but back then, just throw through pieces of wood to prop it up and we're good to go. But it wiped out a lot of the timber and the buildings, and damaged some of the steamboats. So it was no longer economically feasible. Railroads were also making inroads into Suwannee County in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Some of them, like this one, the Live Oak Prairie Gulf, those kinds of things. Dowling Lumber Company's railroad, the Florida Railway, and they were using a lot of that timber, some of which was prior to 1896, some afterwards, this new growth that was popping back up, or that had survived the hurricane of 1896. So they were accessing those. So they were bridging out from Live Oak mainly, going towards Dowling Park, going towards Branford, going all throughout the county. And we've talked about these in a lot more detail. But that was helping to bring different kinds of money into the county and getting produce out of the county, or timber in this case. Branford, even though it had been damaged heavily in 1896, rebuilt. You've got a lot of sawmills and cotton gins, cold storage plant, a bank, a newspaper. They even had their own board of trade, which is like their own chamber of commerce. And then it was a center of farming and livestock in the early 1900s. So this is the Stalvey Hotel, one of the hotels that Branford had. And you see the early automobiles in front of it. This was the Branford Bank, the Branford State Bank, which was organized in 1911. And this was basically opening day in 1911. Had a capital of only $15,000, and Fred Phillips, which is the young man in the front, he was the cashier. The bank, or the county Branford, the town, renewed its charter in 1915 as it continued to grow. But this bank helped bring in capital and helped allow the farmers and those other businessmen to be able to operate more efficient. And this, from what we have been told, what we understand, is this base part of the cashier's windows and stuff is now the museum. If you go to the museum, you'll see something. If it's not it, it's really close to it. But we've been told that that's it. That's the records tell us that is at the museum. So it's pretty fun to still see that kind of stuff 100 plus years later. Dowling Park was growing, and originally, as we talked about before, was Hudson upon the Suwannee, or Hudson on the Suwannee. The Dowling family moved in there with its sawmill. As it cut the timber close to Live Oak, they kept moving over to Hudson upon the Suwannee. Brought in a big sawmill. Thomas Dowling and his nephew Robert Dowling, they each had their own sawmills, so they kind of combined it to make a dual sawmill. So it was a lot bigger than the average sawmill in Suwannee County. And because of the people that they brought into that area, the community renamed itself Dowling Park. By 1910, it had several stores. It had a hotel, it had a railroad depot, it had the lumber company's administrative building. There were 73 tenant houses just for the sawmill workers, not including whatever houses they got otherwise, and then several large homes. Plus, they had the Park Hotel across the river, which had 2 swimming pools, a bowling alley, landscaped grounds, and people would come visit it from all over the world. So again, there's the rain, another way to bring people into Suwannee County. And that's the Park Hotel there in Dowling Park.
That was on the other side.
That was on the other, the Lafayette County side of the river. But it was all part of the same place.
Mm.
And it was run by the folks on our side.
Yay for our side.
Hmm?
Yay for our side.
Yay for our side, that's right. And then, as again I've talked about in previous presentations, Abbott Christian Village came in after Thomas Dowling's death in 1911. The Abbott Christian Village was established on some of the property that he'd given up, donated for a campground originally. But in 1913 it became an orphan home, an orphanage, and old preachers, old worn out preachers, I believe is how it's worded. So they had children and they had retirees there, 1913, 1914. So by 1919 there were 50 children and 12 retirees. And Bert Bixler there, an Abbott Christian preacher and businessman, operated one of the newspapers in Live Oak, but he pretty much administered and helped get it started. So because of him, we've got the Abbott Christian Village even today, which is a major revenue source for the Dowling Park area. And probably the only reason Dowling Park still exists, to be honest, is because of the village. Beautiful place. I mean, I go there every month for presentations, and it's very nice, very quiet, very serene. They've got, they've got a bank, they've got stores, they've got groceries, they've got a couple little cafes, restaurants, obviously medical facilities and that kind of stuff, nursing homes and assisted living facilities. Wellborn was growing. It had its own bank established, the Wellborn Bank, established in 1910. It also had $15,000 of capital, and it was run by E.B. McLaren, the president, which this is his house. And for many years was a bed and breakfast also. But cotton was a big product of Suwannee County, late 1800s, early 1900s. By the first years of the 20th century, and you see different quotes, but sometimes it's 10% of the world supply, maybe it's 10% of the United States supply. Either way, it's a lot of the Sea Island cotton, fine type of cotton that we produce here just in Suwannee County. And because of that, all throughout Suwannee County, we have large cotton ginning companies. This is the one, the Sea Island Cotton Ginning Company in Live Oak, and it was pretty much located where Precision Auto is on Houston and Howard, right there on the corner by the railroad tracks. That was where this big ginning company was, but there were several of them, and this will pretty much encompass an entire block, so it was not a tiny little operation. Now, the other communities would have had some that were smaller than this, but they would have each had their own cotton ginning company pretty much. This is kind of an insurance map showing north is to the right. The railroad tracks would be just off the map on the right-hand side, but you see Howard Street running up and down. But unlike what it does today, it stopped at the Suwannee Ginning Company, jogged down to the south, which is to the left, and then kept going to the west. And that road would take it right past Florida Memorial College, which was a black college and university that we had here for 40, 50 years or more. First Baptist Church, that was their old building. Pretty much First Baptist has this entire campus here now. That was the old Live Oak High School. The football field would be over here. For a frame of reference, courthouse down here. But that's Sea Island Ginning Company, or in this map, Suwannee Ginning Company it was called, took up a lot of space. Unfortunately, in 19-teens, World War I's going on, but we've got our own little war we're fighting here, and that is with the boll weevil. 1917, 1980, it wiped out our crops. I wrote an article, a series of articles, I think, in 2017 about it, kind of like on the 100th anniversary of all that happening and it getting destroyed, but a lot of information on it. I don't really have to read it to you unless you want, but it basically, you can read through the newspaper articles, you can see as it's progressing. As in like 1915, they're talking about, yeah, we've heard about it being in Georgia now, and it's just coming towards us, and we think we can take care of it. And then one of these, this is kind of an understatement, but the quote is, they're talking about state and federal authorities, and they said there was no cause for panic, but that every grower should make plans to reduce acreage as soon as the weevil appears. Yeah. Not too much longer, it arrived in Suwannee County in 1917, and there were all kind of ways they were trying to catch it, all kind of ways they were trying to get rid of it. And basically nothing worked. It just wiped out the fields, cotton fields. A lot of them just said, forget that, and they started growing Spanish peanuts and things like that. Whatever they could do to make ends meet, because that cotton was a cash crop. Lots of people were getting rich off of it. Lots of these ginning companies you had, because people were making lots of money. That was our cash crop. And so they couldn't use it anymore. It was getting wiped out. And so they had to find a new crop. Some of the folks were growing the peanuts because that's something they could sell, but it's also something they could use to eat. Not only them, but also their animals. And so they would do that. But then in 1917, after that point, after the boll weevil wiped out our cotton crops, they were looking for a new cash crop. And so A.D. Gaskins and W.H. Lyle, which this is W.H. Lyle, who was sheriff of Suwannee County at one point, during this point, they went up to, South Carolina, and they started basically trying to bring tobacco farmers down to Suwannee County. And Governor Carey Hardy and others also promoted it, established some tobacco companies. In 1926, a 100-foot by 320-foot tobacco warehouse was built just to sell tobacco. Just the first year, 700,000 pounds worth were sold. And more farmers, I think 1,000 South Carolinians moved to Suwannee County just to grow tobacco. Because by this point, South Carolina had been operating tobacco for 200 years or more, and so their soil was used up that would be good for that. So they came down. The Rotary and Kiwanis clubs helped bring those down and show them the town. And so a lot of folks moved here just to produce tobacco, which became our new cash crop. So still agriculture based, but you've got better ways to do things. Places like the Fordson Tractor and Power Farming Implements Company, which was on East Howard Street. That's basically where the Alomar was. So that's Alomar Court now. That parking spot is basically where that building was. And this is right after they received the new shipment of tractors. So you're not using the mules and horses as much. You've got powered automobiles, powered tractors to be able to do that. And speaking about Christian Village, that building to the right was where the Messenger Press was printed by Bird Bixler. And that was also the ACB, kind of some of their administrative offices there in Live Oak. So we see a slight shift in what products are being produced in Suwannee County. Agriculture still. This is a map of 1920 showing that a lot of these little communities are disappearing because now you've got more automobiles. It's easier to travel longer distances. So you don't need a community every 2 to 5 miles. So a lot of them are disappearing. There's about 20,000 folks in Suwannee County at this point. We were still the largest producer in the state, though. Even with all that destruction, we still were one of the largest producers of cotton, and then also peanuts, corns, hogs, and pecans, or pecans, depending on who you are. I say pecan, my wife says pecan, but she's not from here, so. But people from here say it that way too. I won't ask, because I can gather probably what y'all will say. But it's still primarily agriculture at this point, even in the 1920s. We've also got something called convict leasing, which is where the state would lease out prisoners to the highest bidder to do work, menial work on railroads, work in turpentine, timber, jobs that a lot of people would not want to do because they were so hard. Well, it had been going on for over 40 years at this point, almost 50 years, and it stops in the 1920s because of this young man. His name was Martin Tabert, and he was a resident of North Dakota. And what he did was he hopped a freight train in Leon County, was arrested for it, and he was ordered to pay $25 or spend 3 months at hard labor in the convict camp. Well, his family sent not only the $25 fee, but $25 to get him home. Well, it never arrived, and so he was put in 3 months worth of hard labor. And he went to Dixie County, where they were cutting timber in the swamps, and he got sick. He got fevers, headaches, oozing sores. He was bad off. When he couldn't work, his boss, the boss over him, basically propped him up on his swollen feet and flogged him about 50 times because he wasn't putting in a day's work. And so he just got worse, and he was left unconscious in his bunk, died that night. There was a big outrage, and so Governor Hardy of Live Oak, when he was governor at that point, he shut down the convict leasing system. It had just been abused too much. but that had been a source of labor for the counties for many years. A lot of them up here, a lot of the timber agricultural type products. About the same time that's going on, we see the last steamboat sinking in the Suwannee River. The city of Hawkinsville had basically just been allowed to sit at its berth and rot and sink, and that ends steamboating on the Suwannee River. So that method of transportation of goods, services is no longer around. Mid-1920s, you still have some horses and some mules around, and because of that, you've got blacksmith shops. This one is Sam McGee, who had a blacksmith shop on Dowling Avenue, which is right there by the Dixie Grill. And so he operated as late as 1924. But then he saw where times were going, so he changed from that to ditching it for like an automobile garage. So some of these jobs that folks had, I mean, we're not talking about factories or we're just talking about mom and pop stores or shops, little buildings, let me help you there and make some money, enough to make some money and decent living. But by the 1920s, that era of life was over. Time to move on to something else. 1920s, let's see. We've talked about this one in the past, just some shifts. The schools were now providing more sports because kids were not always out on the farms anymore. They were living in town where they had other jobs or they didn't have jobs. And so more services, more sports were being provided, one of them being soccer. That was our state champion soccer team, nicknamed the Fighting Hebrews because a lot of these guys were Jews. They were state champs, but probably because they were the first soccer team in the state. So weren't a lot of folks to play against. They did play at the University of Florida. Let's see, we've got a female mayor, Ruby Strickland, being elected in 1924. So the first female mayor south of the Mason-Dixon line after universal suffrage was enacted 5 years before. So we've got changes, different things. That wasn't really that wasn't economy related, but it was just showing times were changing. 1929, you've got the stock market crash, which, because of the boll weevil loss, we were already kind of in not the greatest financial straits anyway. So there wasn't much of a difference here. We were already poor. So the stock market crash didn't hurt too much. And it hurt a few people that had money, but for the majority of folks, it was business as usual. 1932 map, which was around 1930. Lots of the smaller communities are gone, unless they were on the railroads. Pretty much everything else was back to wilderness, back to farms, back to whatever. But then you've got Franklin Roosevelt coming into office, elected and coming into office 1933, and he starts trying to put people back to work. And one of those projects that he does, one of the social programs is the WPA, the Works Projects Administration. And some of them come to Suwannee County by 1936, and they're employing about 500 people. I think some of the things they built was the new armory, and that is behind where the supervised elections office is today. It's now that pond where a bunch of ducks usually stay. Right there behind the supervised elections office, that was where that was. Street improvements, they indexed the county's records. They also built or expanded several schools, like the Eddie Basin School, Welborn High School, McAlpin School. This is the official records vault in the courthouse in 1933 or 1934. That is where our records were stored, and that's in the original part of the courthouse. And today is now a judicial hearing room because we ran out of space. It got moved in the 1960s to the downstairs vault or basement that we have. But the funny thing is, if you go down there today, you will see pretty much all these records, all these shelving units and stuff. We still use them, and 100 years later. The guy on the left is Bob Miller, who was the clerk of court at the time. You've got the chief deputy clerk next to him. You've got a couple of researchers, the third and fourth guys, and the last guy, the young guy on the right, was J.L. McMullen, who became the youngest elected official in history at the point. He was like 21, I think, or 22. I knew him. He was an interesting man. But I knew him he was an old man, obviously, by that point. And when I go through these records, because I still use these books to look at the indexes and stuff to figure out where things are. And I don't think everybody that worked on those indexing were from here, because there's some names they really misspelled. Either that or they were very bad typists. Things like Parsley family kept being parsley. So you'll see, if you go in there today, you'll see my little handwritten H in there it's partially, not parsley. So things like that. There's a lot of names that are misspelled that you would, if you were from here, you would know, okay, maybe that is. But either way, it did put people back to work. It was not farm related. It was just a way to give people some money. Farming continued throughout the 1930s, and even with the Depression, we still had about 3,000 farms in Suwannee County. Most of them were very small, just family farm, but we still had a lot of them. Tractors have replaced the mules and horses. The automobiles meant that you could take your produce further than ever before. More people driving through the county, more tourism, if you will. So you've got to build places for them to stay. So you've got places like the Blue Lodge, which was built in 1937 by Laverne Blue on the west side of town on what's US 90 today. It had a large dining hall. It had several brick cabins, live entertainment. It was, I believe they called it a tourist camp or a motorist court, a couple different ways to call it. But basically it was somewhere where you could drive your car and park and spend the night, get some food, get some entertainment, and then drive on somewhere else. So that building is still there, other than the high brick chimney. It's still there. It's basically an apartment complex. 1940, World War II comes along, and 50 to 70% of the farm hands enlist. So you've got a lot less workers. A lot of the women go to work at that point to work not only in the farms, but also other jobs that need to be done. Tobacco is still being produced. Tobacco is still being sold. Prices are rising. A lot more people are smoking it at that point. And so it is these tobacco warehouses, which we had several of them at this point, just in Live Oak, were filled to capacity. This picture's from the 1980s, but that shows how much tobacco was still being produced 40 years later. And it really wasn't until everybody realized tobacco was bad for you, smoking it's bad for your health, that it kind of went away. But that was our cash crop for 50, 60 years, after cotton had been for 40 or 50 years. Post-World War II, 1946 map. Again, you see the railroads, you see some of the major roads, and a few communities. But by this era, in the United States, farming had dropped from half of all workers in 1870 to less than 20%. So there are less people farming, although we have more people in the country. The country is growing population-wise. You have a lot less people actually operating and working in farming because you've got electricity, you've got power equipment. That brings a lot of the choice. You've got the plowing done by tractor. You've got all these kinds of attachments for hay and whatnot that allows one person with one tractor to do a dozen different jobs. You've got milking machines, so now you can hand milk everything. You've got milking machines. You've got the automobiles. You've got paved roads. You've got better access to be able to sell your goods. These tractors and other things produce 3/4 of the power that's needed. So no longer, again, is it the mule or the horse or you that's powering this stuff. You've got all these other things to do. You've got electricity. You've got running water. So all these improvements are meaning that less people can do more producing, agricultural-wise. So other people are moving into other jobs, shifting into businesses and those kinds of things. You've got expansions like Suwannee County Hospital, built after World War II in 1948. It allows, with state federal assistance, allow the county to build this. And this was basically the act that was produced to do this, the Hill-Burton Act, 1948, basically was to give money to rural communities. So they were able to do this a lot better. Started with 44 beds. I was born there. You've got power going into the entire county, not just Live Oak or Branford, but the entire county and beyond. So this is the Elderville Power Plant that was started in September of 1951, built just south of the Suwannee River State Park, which used to be the community of Columbus. It was a 33,000 kilowatt power plant, and it cost $6 million then, which is, I looked yesterday, is $73 million today. So, decent sized power plant. Closed down in December of 2016. One of my great grandfathers moved here to build that. He worked there briefly, and then my grandfather, his son-in-law, basically kind of took over part of his job, and he worked there his entire professional career. Retired at 30 years with it. The building, again, shut down in 2016 and was imploded a few years ago.
What was it powered by?
Originally coal, I believe, and then gas, if I recall. Yeah, as a kid, I remember going in there. It was very loud. You shooting a 5, 6, 7, 8, 10-year-old going in, just hearing all the whining of the turbines and all that kind of stuff. And it was the 50s, so everything inside I recall being green. All the painting, it was all bright green colors. And the control room, which the museum's got some pictures of it, but all the buttons, it was like, oh, cool. It's like, don't touch. Yes, sir. But just to go in and look and see, it's pretty cool. It's right there on the river because they would have runoff going to the river, and they have their own little clubhouse, which I think is still there. So we have like events there, meals and such, but it was very loud. That part I do remember. And lots of stairs.
Is that on the Suwannee or the Madison side?
Suwannee County side.
Suwannee.
Down River Road, like just across there's some railroad tracks that used to be there, but where the J. Beers store is, that road to the south of it, just half a mile to the right. So it's between River Road and the river. But now pretty much in that area is a big solar farm, and that's what replaced it. So because you've got, because you've got this power plant, you've got more access to power. So places like Suwannee Valley Electric Cooperative, using this power, other people's power, were able to get lines run to pretty much everybody in Suwannee County at that point by the 1950s. You also got low-income public housing that's being constructed off Duval Street and some other places to help those who otherwise would not be able to have a house. You've got telephone companies, which we've had around since the early 1900s at least. But Florida Telephone Company, or corporation, was sold to the Wetsteins, became North Florida Telephone Company, later became Alltel. Windstream is what it is today, but using these old switchboards. And we've got some of those very switchboards there at the museum today. So this was one of those businesses or jobs that ladies were suited for and that people were comfortable with women doing. Different times back then, women might be too dainty for some of those jobs, but yes, they can be a switchboard operator. So differences in opinions back then. Let's see. Commercial things going on. We've got our first shopping center opened in 1965, US 90 East, just pretty much across the street from the Brown Manor. And places like Winn-Dixie, McCrory, Sears, Sherwin-Williams, some of the main stores, you can see them in there today. This was in the late 60s and early 70s. And like a lot of shopping centers, those things come and go. Pretty much none of those stores are there today. You still got a few stores, but it's basically a shadow of what it used to be. And growing up, that was one of the places to go. You've got school changes because of the shift in, first off, you're not only just going to school for 3 months out of the year like they used to 50 years before, but you've got better roads, better vehicles, buses, and so they can ship kids further away. So by 1960, we've gone from 100 schools in Suwannee County down to 7. Live Oak, Branford, Welborn, Clayland, McAlpin, those were for the white students, and then O'Brien and Douglas, which was in Live Oak for the African American students. But even that was too many schools, and so by 1963, they start consolidating even those schools. McAlpin loses its 7th and 8th grades, and O'Brien, the same thing happened, and you just have these schools, less schools, but bigger schools. This is the Douglas Center gym, picture from 2023, I believe. Yeah, 2023. About the only part of the school that's left, to be honest. Manufacturing or bigger commercial factories, if you will, businesses. Gold Kiss was one of them, came in the 1967 era, provides 1,500 jobs. So it's still agriculture related, but it's not on the farm. a chicken processing facility, now called Pilgrim's Pride. You got the interstate coming. 1970s is when it really hits, and late 70s is when it kind of gets completed through Suwannee County. Falmouth to I-75 was completed in 1969, and all of I-10 was completed in 1978. So that's a portion by I-10 and I-75. And because of those interstates, people start moving closer to those. One of them being Blackhawk. They built a huge warehouse there across the street, way in the back from Walmart, and 40-acre tract of land, operated for a few dozen years, but then they downsized, sold out, and it's being used by another company that enjoys the access to the interstate. By the 1970s, you've got folks that are more concerned with water quality, with protecting our natural resources, and so you've got a water management district. Suwannee River Water Management District has moved to Live Oak, and that's, you can see in red, maroon, whatever that color is. I call it red, but that's the Suwannee River Water Management District at the time. So it's charged with managing water related resources, and it protects thousands of acres of land and also of water for the future. As businesses start moving further and further away to the bigger cities, or even just into town, you don't have the butcher shop down the road or the grocery store next door. People need transportation. Not everybody can afford to have automobiles, or not everybody is physically or mentally able to drive. And so the Suwannee Valley Transit Authority was established in the 1970s. Originally it had 4 counties: Columbia, Hamilton, Lafayette, and Suwannee. John Lawson was its first director. We still operate today with 3 of those counties. I actually just had a meeting Monday. I'm the secretary for that. That's one of about 8 or 10 boards I'm secretary for. And they still meet, they still provide for those who cannot otherwise go, even to places like Walmart, to the schools, to Gainesville for medical visits, those kinds of things. So they are able to provide for those who can't provide for themselves. New construction in the 1970s, you've got the Suwannee County Mall there on Pinewood Way. At that time when it was built, it housed 25 to 30 stores. The original 3 major occupants were Winn-Dixie, TG&Y, and Super X Drugs. So I remember it as a kid. That was our mall. Woo. Tiny mall compared to others, but that was the big mall that we could go to. And I remember some of those stores. Today, because of rising prices, downturn economy, a lot of the stores left by the 1990s. Winn-Dixie built a new building, just west of it. TG&Y is long out of business. Super X Drugs, I don't know about them. So this is a shadow of its former self. You've got on the east side, which would be the left side, you've got Robbie's Cafe and a few other stores. But a lot of the building kind of sits empty. 1980s sees the Reaganomics, economic expansion, because of President Reagan pumping money into local folks. And one of the businesses, if you will, that comes into Suwannee County is the Spirit of the Suwannee Music Park. They basically take over the property that the Suwannee County Development Authority owns, which is another board I'm secretary for. But they own this property. At one point they looked at making an amusement park out of it, something like Six Flags. But then in Augusta they built Wild Adventures. And so this property kind of sat and languished for a few years, but then the Cornett family came in and offered to make this music park, and so it was sold to them and became Spirit of Suwannee Music Park, and that is a big attractor of people into Suwannee County. We've got all those big bands, big musicians, big events there. I mean, it doubles our population when they have events there. 30,000, 40,000 folks coming in. So that brings in a lot of money. That's not really agriculture related, unless you count the smoking marijuana that some people do there in some of those things. Not everybody, I didn't mean to imply that everybody, but we do see that a lot more arrests when a lot of folks come from out of town. They sometimes go wild. But anyway, it's a different way of making money and bringing revenue into Suwannee County. It has really nothing to do with agriculture. And this one's kind of agriculture related. You've got Klausner in 2013 is building a lumber mill, sawmill, if you will, and then it goes out of business and Vanderholt's buys it up and operates it today. But a huge project there, West 90 by the I-10 interchange, millions of board feet of timber every year. I mean, huge facility, and there are more businesses growing just in that area. It's called a catalyst site, a catalyst to bring more businesses, more factories, more production facilities there, and so they're growing. And that's just a picture of the sawmill. So lots of things coming in. And that's kind of, I guess you'd say, related to agriculture, but it's not a mom and pop farm, if you will. Because they bring timber in from not just Suwannee County, but all the surrounding counties. In the last 30 years, we've seen the growth of what's called ecotourism, and that's people coming to enjoy the springs, the river, getting away from the big city life, and just coming to relax. And we've got a lot of springs, some of the most, probably the most amount of springs in the state. So a lot of folks can come here and enjoy it. They can travel the Suwannee River, which is one of the few rivers in Florida that has not grown up. And so a lot of natural wonders that we have, which brings a lot of folks to visit, sometimes to stay, but it at least brings revenue into the county. These are some statistics which I got several years ago that didn't look like there was much of a change, so I didn't bother updating it. But you can see some of the industries and how much of the workforce is involved. So education, health, social services, about 28%. Agriculture, forestry, fishing, hunting, and mining still has about 24%. But that's more than just the agriculture, more than just farming. You've got professional, scientific, etc., which is another 14%. Arts, entertainment, recreation, food services, 13%. A lot of different changes. And actually, that 24% for agriculture, etc., is a lot higher than state average. We're just still a residential rural community. Most folks have a lot less. I mean, go to Miami. What, 0.1%? That 1 million acre plot of land? I mean, I've got somebody that works with me that came up from South Florida. I mean, she grew up in Florida, but she grew up in the Florida when places like Manatee County were like here, or worse, more backwards or whatever. You know, growing up on the river, her dad fished, those kinds of things. I mean, they grew stuff on the farm, but then all these other folks came in, started selling off the farms, and I mean, you know, Naples, Venice, places like that were shanty towns, really, 75 years ago, 50 years ago, had grown up. So one day it may happen to us. I hope not. I hope it's not that bad. Hope we stay rural to an extent, have different kinds of managed growth. But I'll shut up there because I'm throwing personal things in instead of history. But Suwannee County still has a good portion of agriculture related stuff. But again, that's a lot higher than the state and national average. Here's some of the non-farm industries that we had a few years ago. And again, I haven't updated it because it's really about the same thing. And this is for about 12,000 employees that earned a few years ago $700 million a year. Natural resources, construction, manufacturing, trades, information, all those different things that Suwannee County had as of a few years ago. So let's see. Yeah, several years ago when this information I'd gotten, and it really hadn't changed much, there were about 7,500 employees in 1,200 farms. And most of those farms earn less than $1,000 per year. So basically they're just somebody's backyard growing an acre or two of stuff. So most of our farms are family farms. You've got a few large farms, few that have bought up a lot of other farms around them. And then you've got a lot of this other kind of stuff going on. So again, we're still primarily agriculture or rural, but we've got technology, we've got shifting needs, and so there's a lot less folks that are working on the farm than there were 50, 75, 100, 150 years ago. So, you know, we see this shift not just in Suwannee County, but all throughout the country and really the world. Once you start developing, becoming a developed country, you move away from that agrarian society and move into industrial and now post-industrial societies, where a lot of people are making money outside of farming, outside of industry. Services and those kinds of things are more of the go-to. So, that's today's presentation at an hour. Next month, Lord willing, women's history. Any questions, thoughts, comments?